a lot of the entrepreneurs are very, very good at being entrepreneurs. They're not necessarily as competent in terms of how to translate that into the regulatory environment. We forget how new the concept of a financial influencer is. You know, now that we're having Markets 3.0, which is the electronic trading with added AI, this is very new.
Do you think with the Trump's presidency at the moment, the landscape is going to change towards crypto?
I think the landscape is going to change dramatically. It is going to be enabling assets like crypto to be more coming into the mainstream, digital-based assets. If you thought that my shares had value, I'll give them to you. I'll settle the debt by giving you shares. So you've got tax avoidance, tax evasion, money laundering, fraud. So there's enough legislation out there to make your life uncomfortable without having to worry about the Financial Conduct Authority or other regulators.
Hello and welcome to ICA Podcast, a space where we share the insights and expertise of members and partners of ICA Consulting. We exist to help your businesses grow and develop at speed you prefer, connecting you to our network and making sure everything is aligned for your success. Our guest today is our compliance expert with over 40 years of experience, Simon Carse. Please enjoy the podcast and connect to our Telegram channel for further insights. Hello everyone and welcome to ICA Podcast. We're happy to present our financial compliance expert today, Simon Carse. Hi Simon.
Hi, good afternoon.
Being on the podcast, and I know it's the third time that we're recording the podcast and I did tell some of the people in the audience as well that it didn't go quite well last two times, but purely because of filming. Now we're fully set up and now we're fully ready to share all the information that you would like to share with the audience. But before we do that, I obviously prepared with the questions, but one of the things that we would like to feel is who you are as a person.
Okay.
And how it came to this that you dropped into the financial compliance.
Okay, so let me give a little bit of background. I came into the markets, my interest in the market started in 1967 when sterling devalued against the US dollar. And that was the first time I became aware of the fact that there was a market. And that sterling went from 2.8 to 2.4, and I thought, I can work that out because there's 240 pennies to the pound, and dollar sterling is 2.4, so it's 1.1. And I was 12 years old, but I was able to work that out. So then we fast forward a little bit, and we get to the mid-70s. In 1975, I start working in the financial markets. And in those days, it was just the brokerage world for commodities, because there weren't the regulated financial markets in the way that we know them today, some 50 years later. So I spent 30 odd years dealing in the commodity markets first, then involved in the financial markets, and then I traded equities and fixed income and various other different products around the world.
So you tapped into every sector.
I've been very fortunate because I've been exposed over 30 years in the dealing room. I've been exposed to all the different types of products, types of markets that there are, whether it's options, whether it's foreign exchange trading, interbank trading, or trading on the exchanges. So I did that for quite a long time. I did that in the UK. I spent time out in Singapore. So I got an international flavour of the markets, which is quite a good thing to do at quite a young age, because I was in Singapore in 1984, working with the Monetary Authority of Singapore when they were setting up the exchange, the Simex exchange, which became notorious with Nick Leeson some 10 years later. And then early 2000s, the markets moved away from what I had been used to, which was what we call voice-based relationship broking, where it's very much one-to-one, and they moved into Markets 2.0, which became point and click. And we're now going to be moving into Markets 3.0 because it's point and click with added AI. But we can talk about that.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later. Yeah.
But as far as Markets 2.0 are concerned, when we moved away from voice-based to the point and click space, I then at that point took my dealing room experience and my trading and understanding of the markets and started to apply that into the corporate governance and the regulatory world. Because when I started in 75, the regulatory environment was didn't exist in the format that we know it, and it didn't really It had various iterations, various evolvements, but it became more of a defined product in the early 2000s. And so the early 2000s, I moved into the regulatory space, into the compliance infrastructure, and I've worked with regulators in the US, the UK, Dubai, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Australia.
Breathe.
So I have an understanding, and what I would say to all of the people that I work with is all the regulators are singing the same song, but some are using different words and others are using different music.
Yeah.
So they think they're singing the same song, but they're singing their own version of it, or they're making up their own accompaniment.
Yeah.
So when I work with the clients, it's a matter of understanding, is the client undertaking regulated activity? Because sometimes they think they are when they're not, or they don't think they are, but they are. So it's a matter of working out whether what activity the client is undertaking needs to fit within the regulatory environment and what part doesn't.
Right. And since we moving into this part now, what would you say are the biggest challenges which the professionals are facing today in financial compliance?
I would say the biggest challenges are understanding the risks that exist within the business aren't immediately obvious to them as businessmen, because they think that they're running a brokerage, therefore the risk is, how do we get clients? There are other risks that the regulator looks at, which is not how do you get clients, but how do you protect the assets that the clients are going to give you.
And how do you protect the customers?
And how do you protect the customers? Yeah. So the regulator assesses one risk for the business and the firm believes it has another risk. So it is a matter of understanding what the firm wants to achieve from a business model point of view, understanding the risks that are inherent within that nature of that business, finding good staff, finding good premises, successful product, and people coming to work with the brand, which is great. Building a business are the risks that the entrepreneurs understand. What I can help them do is I can translate how the regulatory risks and the regulatory infrastructure that exist in the market interfaces of what they're trying to achieve. And they might not be able to achieve it one way because the regulator doesn't like that approach or it's not appropriate, and they think that clients might be put at risk. So I can say, look, this is how you want to do it. This is how the regulator wants you to do it. So let's work together to get an optimal solution which meets your objectives as a business, because you have a commercial imperative. You're looking to achieve results that are going to be profitable for your business. But at the same time, you want to work in a compliant regulatory fashion for the world. So the risk, the biggest challenge that I think that firms see is translating their idea, their vision, into something which is going to fit within the environment in which they're going to operate. Now, not every business requires the same solution, because you might be looking to provide a boutique service to a small group of clients in a particular community. You might be looking to service a particular expat community in a certain area who have got a certain risk appetite and a certain approach. So your business model would be tailored towards them. Right. You might have other firms that are looking to do a one-size-fits-all. We want to be the next JP Morgan, want to be the next BlackRock, want to be the next big thing in the street. We've got the great ideas. So the solutions that are appropriate, each solution has to be compliant, but it also has to be relevant to the business.
Right.
So, for example, if you're a small bespoke broker and you're doing a business plan for the regulator, they would expect 10 or 20 pages. But if you were wanting to take on the world and you want to become a major financial institution, the business plan will be 300 or 400 pages and as a summary. And if you go to the point that you want to regulate to become a bank, you need to produce a 100-page summary of your business plan and do a one-day presentation to the regulator in front of a team of regulators doing the old PowerPoint in a transparency folder presentation. So that's a major undertaking. Yeah, but the key thing is that we don't want clients to think that the solution that they'll be giving is inappropriate to their needs. Yeah, so the first thing we have to do is to understand, what does the client want to achieve? Why does the client think that they can achieve it? and what is the most cost-effective way of helping them do that whilst remaining compliant as a business.
Right.
So those are the challenges, but those challenges have always remained, but have always existed, but they have become more relevant to the market, particularly as the financial markets are becoming more obvious to the world generally, and people have greater access to information through social media, which might not have been available 10, 15, 20 years ago. We forget how new the concept of a financial influencer is. We tend to think, well, it's always been there in the markets. Well, no, it really hasn't. These are new, these are new things that need to be understood. And the way that, as we're going to talk later, now that we're having Markets 3.0, which is the electronic trading with added AI, then again, this is very new.
It poses an additional layer of complication.
But it's an additional layer of opportunity, but it needs to be fully understood.
Right. I see.
From both a risk point of view and objective point of view, but I can't help a client understand their risks if I can't understand their objectives, and I can't understand their objectives if I can't understand the client.
Yeah, it's almost like you need to become a client. Yes, you need to think like a client.
You need to think like a client, which is where I've been fortunate enough that my experience as being a client and a broker for 30 years before I got into this space gave me the opportunity to think like the client. So I think that's a very perceptive answer.
Excellent. Okay, next question. What are the licensings that you're usually helping businesses with, and what is the approach that you're taking?
So really following on from what we were saying about understanding the business, the license is driven by the particular regulatory environment that the firm wants to operate in. So if you're a pension provider, then you would need to have a pensions license, for example. If you were selling funeral plans, you need to be regulated to sell funeral plans.
If you're a brokerage firm,
if you're a brokerage firm, you need to be regulated as a broker. So within the legislation of the UK, and the legislation of the UK is not necessarily the only piece of legislation out there, but it's a primary piece of legislation, and it's based on good ideas that, one, the UK have had, and two, that they've been able to verify against other regulators. Because obviously if one regulator in the UK, if the regulatory environment in the UK is structured one way, and the regulatory environment in another country is structured another way, you're going to get people trying to take advantages of the difference in the regulatory approach. You're trying to get regulatory arbitrage. So it's important, going back to understanding the business, understanding what they want to achieve. Then you say, look, do you want to be a financial institution as far as dealing with banks are concerned? Do you want to be a professional institution dealing with other professionals, or do you want to be dealing with the general public? And then once we know whether you're dealing with the general public or who you're dealing with, then what is the products that you're going to be dealing with? Right. Are you going to just be a broker? Are you just going to be a service provider? Or are you going to be somebody in a different space? So the licensing can be tailored. Licensing it's not a one size fits all solution. The Financial Services Market Act, which governs legislation in the UK, financial services, was the largest single piece of legislation ever to go through Parliament, other than the Great Reform Bill, which we signed after Brexit. But as a single act for a single product, it was the largest single piece because the scope is so broad. The scope is so broad, from mortgages to funeral plans to banks to insurance companies to brokerage to equities to capital markets. It's very big because you're really creating a regulatory environment for any economic activity. And some of that regulated activity needs to be protected and some of it doesn't. Right? If you go and buy a car from a friend or from somebody in the street and they sell you a car and it's £5,000, it's not deemed to be regulated activity. But if you set up a garage to do that and you provide finance for people to buy cars, then suddenly you're a credit broker, which requires regulation. So you've taken what you used to do as a hobby, which is buying a car, cleaning it, fixing it, and then selling it to your friends or selling it to people in the street. You've taken it into a hobby, into a business. And at some point, by doing it into a business, someone's come to you and said, I don't have the 5,000, can you lend me the money? And then you say, no, I can't lend you the money, but I can help I know somebody who can, then you're a credit broker. So you suddenly become a regulated institution.
And all of a sudden you need a license.
Exactly. So it's quite interesting because some businesses evolve into regulated activity without realising it. Another case, just briefly, I was dealing with some people who were managing a property management company. And property management company, you pay your ground rent, your maintenance charge and your insurance. So once a year, this firm is billing the tenants in the building, the ground rent, the maintenance charge and the insurance. And he's been doing that for 40 years.
Okay.
Where is that regulated?
I'm not sure.
The insurance premium is regulated money because he's giving it to another financial services firm. He's collecting insurance premium for one person and giving it to somebody else. So while he's holding that money, it's a client asset. It's not his money.
Yeah.
Because if he has to pay the insurer, he can't spend that money. The maintenance money he can spend on painting the walls if he wants to and fixing the lift and all of those things, right? But the insurance premium isn't his money because he's not insuring the building. It's the insurer's money. So he collects the insurance premium, has to hold that into a separate bank account because it's a separate client asset, and then pay it to the insurance company when the premium is due. Now, he started as a property management firm 40 years ago, so he never would think it was a regulated issue.
He would never know. How would he know?
It's difficult if you don't know. That's the problem. It's very difficult. You know, the insurance company eventually went to him and said, "How are you accounting for the insurance premium?" And he said, "Well, I'm just giving it to you." They said, "Yes, but you can't do that because it's regulated activity." Oh, and then he had to ask and do the research and then become regulated.
I see.
So
you would explain to your clients what are the peculiarities of each and every license, and you would step into their shoes and essentially help them understand all of it and together with the landscape.
And the other thing is that, you know, when you think of go back to something a bit more modern. You talk of a fintech client where they've got a new application for managing financial resources, etc. So your fintech client comes to us and says, "We want to be regulated." I say, "Why?" "Well, we're providing financial technology." I said, "Yes, but why do you want to be regulated?" So I said, "Look, you've got a technology division, which has nothing to do with regulation. It's just software. It's a software company. But you've got the software, but then you've got the technology being used by a firm to provide services to the clients." So the bit that you create one company to provide services to the clients, which licenses the technology from the software company. So you separate the two out.
And this way you don't need a license.
And this way you get the bit that is licensed is the bit facing the customer, but the software development doesn't need to be licensed. Right? And the regulator doesn't care. So you don't want them in the same business. Because then, the other reason being they don't want them in the same business is that if someone comes to the software company in 5 years' time and says, "I want to buy your software company, we want to sell it to Microsoft or whatever," they don't want to buy a broker, a regulated broker, right? You want to be able to sell them that company and still keep your regulated broker coming along. Alternatively, if someone comes to you in 5 years' time and says, "I want to buy your regulated broker," you want to keep your software business. So you have to separate them. But in the beginning, it was one company, one fintech company, a group of clever guys and girls, software programming, building the app that's going to solve the world, solve the problems of the world. And you have to make sure that it is relevant to that they're regulating the part that they want to regulate, and that is regulated in one bit. Intellectual property is owned in the regulated business, software is owned in another business, and the two. You might have a common ownership above, which is fine. You can do that.
And if you want to sell the licensed business, you can always do that, and you can sell your license as well.
So it's all about understanding. Right, as you said earlier, Polina, it's about understanding what the client wants to achieve and how they want to achieve it. And a lot of the entrepreneurs are very, very good at being entrepreneurs. They're very, very good at coming up with good ideas and developing products and all of those things, which is fantastic. They're not necessarily as competent in terms of how to translate that into the regulatory environment. which is why they'd come to me, because I'm not the entrepreneur.
Yeah.
I'm not clever enough, right? I'm the specialist on the compliance side and the corporate governance side. But it is a matter of finding the solution which is appropriate for the client. Because if it's appropriate for the client, then you can take it to the regulator and then you can get the business regulated. But if it doesn't meet the client needs, then there's no point in getting it regulated because the regulator says, what do we regulate? And the client says, I don't know. So you have to build it out.
Yeah, of course. No, that's very important. While we're on that, would you say that there are occasions when companies don't know that they need to be regulated, and what happens if they're already operating in the business for say 3 years, not too much, but they've been doing some business and they didn't know that they have to be regulated? What does FCA do to them?
Well, okay, going back to the insurance situation, for an example, the requirement to become regulated was something that evolved into the business. So the regulator would be initially sympathetic, but at the same time, the argument that ignorance is no excuse is quite correct. You're a professional running a business, you should know what you need to do to run that business. So the regulators will theoretically, on a scale, give them a little bit of understanding and say that as long as there was no criminal intent, no intent to mislead the general public or to mislead us as regulators, we will give you a soft pass. In other words, we'll regulate you, but you just got to make sure that you behave yourself. So that occasionally happens, and the regulators are generally quite grown up about that. Where the regulators have a lot of sanction and get very upset is if the regulator feels that they've been misled, either inadvertently or deliberately, or the regulator feels that they have been that you have been operating in a way which has led to consumer harm and detriment. Because that's where the regulators obviously get very upset, because they get very distraught, and quite rightly, if somebody has created a scheme which would imperil the wealth of others through fraudulent activities. That becomes another thing, because that's then you go into the life of fraud, which, regardless of regulation, fraud can be criminal activity. Deceit with intent to mislead others. So you're at risk from being charged with fraud. You're at risk of being involved in corruption. You're at risk of being involved in money laundering allegations, because obviously if you've taken money from a third party and you haven't declared that revenue correctly, then you've avoided tax. So you've got tax avoidance, tax evasion, money laundering, fraud. So there's enough legislation out there to make your life uncomfortable without having to worry about the Financial Conduct Authority or other regulators, because you're already in trouble.
Right.
Okay. So, and then the third section is that if you have tried to be a little bit clever and you've run a business and you've told the regulators we're going to do A, B and C and we're going to do it in a very small, discreet manner, and they say, that's great, and then you go and do D, E and F, which they said that you can't do, and you go and do it in a very big manner, hiding behind what you said originally, then the FCA will get upset. Now, the FCA is a statutory, although it's a corporation, it's a statutory body. So the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, has its own statutory powers to prosecute. It doesn't need to go to the Crown Prosecution Service or to the courts. The FCA can bring its own prosecution. And the FCA, when it raids recently, generally, when the FCA raid a firm, it has its own officers, and they will be accompanied by the police, who are there to ensure that there's no difficulty and no bad behaviour by people.
Wow.
But the FCA have they don't need the police to go with them. They have enough authority in their own right. They're a statutory corporation with their own powers of prosecution, in the way that, unfortunately for other reasons, the post office has become notorious.
Right.
They're also a statutory corporation with their own powers of prosecution. And there are several government bodies that have that, and people, it's 99.9% of our clients would never need to know this because they never get involved in it. So from that point of view, it's not a problem. But it's still useful to understand the power and the sanction that the regulators actually have in the UK. And they have their own powers to do a dawn raid with police going through the doors and taking you away in handcuffs and all of those things. The FCA can do that on demand.
Oh my God!
Okay, so
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Their power is push comes to shove. They have a lot of power. A lot of authority to execute the power. Now they have to be very careful how they execute, how they deploy that.
Of course.
That authority, and we have seen when a statutory body like the FCA or the Post Office have misused or misplaced their authority, it's caused more problems than it's solved.
I see. So you're a knight on the mission.
Exactly.
Yeah. I see. Wow. That might be a very big challenge to work with those kind of people. I know it's very serious. Yeah. I will abrupt a little bit. Apologies, but we all understood that FCA is a very serious organization. So I'm
not trying to scare anybody, but we just need to understand the scale and complexity of the environment we're operating in.
Mm-hmm. As you spoke about the differences between US and UK regulations and the terms in those regulations, do you know about the latest changes that they're doing, and if they're different from US to UK, and if we need to really focus on those differences?
I think those differences are going to become magnified in the immediate term. I don't think it's too early yet to have complete clarity as to what regulatory changes are going to be in the US, because the new administration is relatively new in place, and there's a lot to do. Classically, the G7 legislators have tended to move in lockstep. So the FCA and the SEC in the US and the NFA in the US and BaFin in Germany and Consob in Italy, they've all tended to work on the same they've all ridden in the same elevator. And they might have had slightly different interpretations, and the Americans rely much more on what is written down compared to the FCA, who rely on intent. So the FCA would say, what did you mean to do? And the Americans would say, what have you said you're going to do? So if you've written something down, so it goes, in the UK, we don't have wire fraud. In America, you have wire fraud. So wire fraud is when you write a letter and you post it to somebody, and that letter is fraudulent, and then that you're using the US Postal Service to commit fraud.
Interesting.
Right. So that's an offence. But in the UK, we don't have quite the same approach to it. We have slightly different approaches.
Right.
So there are different approaches in enforcement, and there are different approaches in regulatory approaches. So, for example, the main difference, I would say, between the FCA and the SEC up to the new administration, but the principal approach, the SEC make it very easy, Securities Exchange Commission in the US, they make it relatively easily become regulated. They don't ask many questions during the application process.
Okay.
But once you're regulated, you have to give them information more or less on a daily basis. On a continual basis. They want to know everything all the time about what you're doing.
So they get you in the system and you report on a daily basis.
They want a continual report. All right? You have a whole division just doing reporting. Whereas the FCA will spend 3 or 6 months approving you during the regulatory process, getting to know everything they can about you. Colour of your hair, length of your fingernails, everything they can obtain. Once you're regulated, you might never hear from them again. You might do a report once every 3 months or 6 months, and that's it. But they're never going to ring you. I've got clients who've been regulated for 10 years. The FCA have never called them once.
So they stress test you straight away?
They stress test you at the time of application. So that's the cultural differences. Now, in terms of the legislative changes, we see already that there are going to be a different approach to the use of digital-based assets or crypto assets in the marketplace. And already a lot of brokerage firms are now who handle crypto assets reckon about 20% of their income is coming out of that activity now. It's becoming very, very profitable for them. That's partly because there's not many doing it, so the ones who are doing it are making a lot of money.
Okay, and do you think with the Trump's presidency at the moment, the landscape is going to change
Completely.
towards crypto?
I think the landscape is going to change dramatically, and I don't think it is going to be towards crypto or away from crypto, but it is going to be enabling assets like crypto to be more coming into the mainstream. It is simpler to get rid of legislation which says you can't do something than it is to adopt legislation to say that you can.
Indeed.
Okay, so a little bit different. It's like the common law approach and the Napoleonic Code in Europe. So the Napoleonic Code is everything is forbidden unless it's allowed. Whereas the common law in the Anglo-Saxon UK is everything is allowed unless it's forbidden.
I see.
So there's a slightly different sort of mindset from a legal perspective. Now in the US, everything that you're allowed to do everything, but the law there's a huge amount of law. So you look at Dodd-Frank, which is a very largest piece of legislation, the Dodd-Frank Consumer Reform Bill and Consumer Protection Act, a big long title. Two things happened when that came in, when that was promulgated in the US. Firstly, it was deployed and hated in the markets. Secondly, the Singaporeans decided to use it as a case study of bad legislation. So the Singaporean legal universities and economic universities immediately used it as a case study as how ineffective and cumbersome regulation really is.
Oh my God.
Whereas in Europe, we just struggle to try to deploy it.
Yeah.
So
that's quite a different approach.
It is a very different approach. So I think from what the early signs are, and these are very early signs, but I think that what we're going to see is the US is going to move towards simplifying the regulatory environment. It's not a matter of deregulating it. It's just a matter of making it straightforward. If you go back to Swiss banking law, 50 years ago, it was a sheet of paper which said you cannot do criminal acts.
That's it.
That was it.
Wonderful.
Right?
Yeah.
And that, which is actually quite clever, because it's a very powerful law, because they can come to you and say that's criminal, you can't do it.
Yeah, they don't quite specify what is criminal, right?
Correct. So there's a very wide scope, but at the same time it gave you a lot of room. Whereas the UK approach has been to write down every single possible criminal act that could occur. Right? And then someone comes and says, yes, but you don't say this, you say that, so we can say something else and then we're okay.
Yeah.
And then you're arguing over the spaces and sentences and what the word "the" means and what the word "that" means, which just becomes, great for the lawyers, right? Very expensive for the lawyers. But not so effective for for what we're trying to achieve. So the Americans are going to simplify their regulatory approach.
Okay.
The Americans are going to, through simplification, they're going to allow other assets to be included, which will be digital-based assets. And the most classic example, if you look at one particular crypto asset, which is called Ripple, Ripple had been in dispute with the SEC for 5 years about whether it should be treated as a security or not. Because if it's treated as a security, it should be regulated. And the price of Ripple was 35, 40 cents, 50 cents, 60 cents a unit for 5 years. Huge legal bills, fighting with the SEC for a long, long time. After the 5th of November, that case collapsed, and Ripple is now at $4. So it's gone up tenfold, because it's now no longer deemed a security. So the SEC have lost the battle. They weren't winning the battle, but because they were trying to stifle it.
Yeah.
Right. That was the point. Okay. There was no. It got into the. I suppose the equivalent of the big tobacco, where you had Ripple with 50 lawyers and the SEC with 100 lawyers, and they're all just spending the time on conference calls, requesting documents backwards and forwards from each other, and nothing gets done other than the lawyer bills just go up and up and up, but there's no decision is made because everybody's got piles of documentation to really. So the transactional nature of the Trump administration, which we have already seen, is let's make it transactional, Let's
just allow
let it exist, and rather than ban it as a product, what we'll do is we will try to control the people who are using it, right? Rather than try and ban. So you try and ban. So you do it from the outside in, not from the inside out, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit like banning people making hamburgers, which is very complicated because sometimes it's not really a hamburger, but it's minced meat, but it's in this and it's in that. So what you do is you say, let people make hamburgers, but what we're going to do is we're going to regulate the distribution of the hamburgers and how they can be sold and how junk food can be advertised to young children after certain times of the day.
Ooh.
So you control the perimeter to it, but you let it exist inside. So as far as the crypto world is concerned, I think the approach that the Americans will probably look to adopt is to simplify the product, simplify the approach, let the assets exist, let people buy and sell them, but just have a firmer firewall perimeter on the outside to try to avoid them being used by the terrorist organisations and various other bits and pieces. If you allow it as a form of payment within the government, then you can apply the same sanction to it that you would a US dollar. You haven't got to define it. You haven't got to have separate legislation, one for sanctions for the US dollars in North Korea, and another set of legislation around crypto in North Korea. You just say it's a medium of exchange. These rules apply. So whether it's a crypto, whether it's a dollar, it's the same rule. Okay. So you've taken one law and said, we're going to let this in, and now this product is now governed by that law.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. So you got laws governing this production of food in America. So you create a new food group and you just say, well, rather than say you can't have this food group, this type of hamburger, we're just going to classify it as a hamburger, and then all the hygiene regulations apply to it. So it then becomes very simple. So I think that's the easiest way for it.
That's a very easy way of doing it. It's just it poses a big...
Don't be scared.
I would say it poses a very big change on the crypto and regulation and all of those beautiful things.
Stop it being a demon.
Yeah.
I mean, the weird thing from my point of view is that in the UK, if you buy a share and you pay full value for a share in a company at £5 and it goes down to 50p, well, that's your risk, right? And shares do that all day long.
Yeah.
But the regulators are terrified that you buy crypto at $10,000, it goes to $5,000. Well, a crypto is no more risky than trading equities, right? And in fact, if you look at the volatility, although it's a big number, you look at the volatility of Bitcoin over the years, it's less volatile than an awful lot of mainstream US stocks. It's less volatile than Nvidia, which is the big microchip company in the US. It's less volatile than Tesla. It's less volatile than Boeing. It's less volatile than British Airways.
Yeah.
So,
but it doesn't act as a network. It acts as a
payment. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, but I could pay you in shares.
You can pay me in shares. Yeah.
Yeah, I could give you if I wanted to. Yeah. If you wanted to accept, if you thought that my shares had value, so I said to you, I've got 10 shares in Lloyds Bank. I'll give them to you. Right? To settle the debt. I'll settle the debt by giving you shares. Right? It's a medium of exchange. Not a very convenient medium of exchange, a little bit cumbersome, and there's stamp duty to pay, and you've got to get the shares registered and all of those things. But it's still a medium of exchange.
So this gives a lot of new opportunities to the companies who are trading in Web3.
Well, when we go back, we go back to Market 3.0.
Yeah, Market 3.0. So we're connecting AI to it.
Yeah.
Cryptocurrency becomes same thing as money, essentially.
It's just a medium of exchange.
this does give a lot of advantages to the people who are trading with AI, right? Or how?
Well, AI is extremely useful, but it is a very efficient and very powerful tool. It isn't anything other than that. I mean, and I'm not trying to belittle it because it's incredibly clever, and we know that it will have, artificial general intelligence will exist. At some point, if it doesn't exist now, it'll exist in 3 months' time. If not 3 months' time, it'll exist in 3 years' time. But it's going to come, right? So we don't need to worry about whether it exists or not. But what we need, not what is beneficial to understand, in my view, is that it is an enabling tool. So think of it as a very effective search engine, a very effective person technology interface. So very simply, you can say to, Google, can you? I want to search this information. I want a restaurant here, and it comes up with a restaurant. You go to ChatGPT. Can I have 3 restaurants in a similar area and why they're good? And it comes up with the same restaurants, but a much more usable piece of data. As far as the markets are concerned, markets are a zero-sum game. You cannot lose $1 without someone making $1, and you can't make $1 without someone losing $1. So somewhere in the world, for every $1 that's lost, there's $1 made, and for every $1 made, there's $1 lost. The AI is a very useful tool in terms of helping people build trading systems, for example. There's a lot of move towards this thing called an expert advisor. An expert advisor is a bit of software. So you say to it, if X happens and Y happens, do Z, yep. Right? And if X and Y happened and I did Z, how much would I make? And then you run it through the data, and the expert advisor comes back and says you would have made $1 or you would have lost $1. So you think, well, I would have lost $1. So what was I doing wrong? So you change the parameters and then ask it again. So you end up with an answer. With the AI obviously massively speeds up that process, and you can say to the AI, what parameters would I have? You can reverse engineer rather than say, if I did A and B, how much would I make? You can say to it, to make $1, what do I have to do? Do I have to do A, B, or C? Right? And it will come back with an answer. The problem, not the problem, but the situation is that all of this is on historical data. Yeah. And all historical data is out of date. Okay. Because by its very nature. And consequently, the AI model, although it is predictive, it is always predicting from what has been. And it could be very cleverly predictive from what has been, but eventually what has been will change, because if you have 10 AIs, let's suppose the markets for the next week were only driven by 10 AI chatbots. Right. At the end of that week, the price data would have been created by the 10 AI chatbots will have a different footprint to the previous data. So then you take the new set of historic data, because we're now in a week ahead, and you do it again. But of course, you're doing it on, again, old data.
Right, I see.
Every model analyzes data, assumes that the markets are rational, and that they're equally liquid. In other words, you can buy and sell the same amount at any time, at any price, which is not the case. Right?
But would the FCA change in terms of their attitude if they know that the business is trading with AI?
No. What all the FCA would want to know is how you manage it. Have you identified the risks, and how you're managing those risks? Right? And you have to put forward. I mean, the FCA are using AI already. The FCA are using AI on applications.
Just so checking the application.
You submit an application and they run it through the AI first.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
And the AI would tell yes or no, this is absolute nonsense and it's not even worth looking at.
Yeah.
All right.
But the problem is that it's not very good.
Okay.
And this is, this is one of the other issues I have. I know from all trading systems, whether it's AI or whatever it is. What I'm trying to say is that you give a computer a set of trading data and say run through the day trader. The computer doesn't know how that trading data was created, and every product group has a different price signature. Mm-hmm. So what I'm saying is that very classically, and maybe this is a different topic, and we can do a thing
next time, maybe.
We'll do a separate topic on the nature of price discovery, because some prices are designed by transaction. You know the value because people have bought and sold, and that share traded at the price.
Yep.
Other prices are determined by a quotation.
That's different.
Which is different, because a transaction is evidence of the trade. A quotation is an evidence that somebody quoted a price, but not necessarily that the transaction existed.
Right, so it's only an intent that's getting recorded and not the actual transaction.
And the other issue is that the price of a commodity, say corn, corn generally as a commodity price can double or halve. Right, it's unlikely that corn is going to more than double, and it's unlikely it's going to do more than half in value. Right, because if it goes too low, people will stop growing it. If it goes too high, people will grow more and they'll stop using it so much. So if corn is $5 a bushel today, in the next 10 years, it'll go somewhere between 2.5 and 10, ostensibly, right?
Yep.
Okay, so there's natural barriers to where it can go.
Right.
Now, a share price of IBM could be $100 today. In the next 10 years, IBM could go to zero, which corn couldn't do, because IBM could go bust, or IBM could go to $10,000, which corn couldn't do. Right? So the shares have a different price signature. Shares can go to nil or infinity. Corn can halve or double. So straight away, your price data for your AI that you build on trading equities, you apply it to corn, it's going to have a different result because the price structure is different.
Yeah, but that's different and more complicated and multi-layered topic.
Correct.
Which we're going to get into on the next time. At the moment, thank you so much for the amount of information that you've given us, and I know that financial compliance is an extremely complicated topic, and the business owner is obviously struggling without people like you. As an encompassing message for the business owners, what advice would you give them?
I think the key thing is to spend the time, firstly, in defining what they want to achieve in the market from their product base. That's the absolute key thing. It's one thing to say, I've invented a product. Okay, great. You've invented Red Bull or you've invented Microsoft Excel. But what do you want to achieve with that product? Where is your market and why do you think that is your market? And at that point, once you really understand what you can do with the product, like James Dyson invents the bagless vacuum cleaner, well, fantastic. But what did you do with it? So once you know what you can do with that product, and then you realise that there might be touch points within the financial service market space, then we need to have the conversation to work out which bits of the conversation, whether it's the intellectual property and the brokerage, which bits of the market need to be regulated, if any. Are you going to be ending up crossing the perimeter? And you think of regulation, though. Think of regulation as an asset, not a burden.
Yeah, because it helps you in the end.
It helps you. It's enabling, right? You're licensed. You're given a degree of reputation by the regulator to enhance your brand, which, from a marketing point of view, without that, is very difficult. It's quite expensive to achieve. To achieve reputation in a brand is difficult. So if you can build on your brand reputation by anchoring it to the fact that you're regulated and approved by the Financial Conduct Authority, the Securities Exchange Commission, whichever is your host regulator, automatically gives you leverage on your brand.
Right.
So it adds value to your product without realizing.
Nice. Thank you so much. That's a great advice.
My pleasure.
And It would be nice to talk to you about the price points next time.
We'll talk about the price points next time. Thank you very much, Belina. Thank you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.